Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 238, Line Defining Stitches in Machine Embroidery. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome into the Takeup. Happy to have you here on this Education Friday, where we are coming together again to learn about embroidery and digitizing and the interpretation of art, the things that keep this business going, that help us do our craft and our art and our creation, and that makes everything possible. I mean, there's so much of what we do that is outlined or requires line to define itself, whether we're talking about straight stitch work, single color work, if we're talking about multicolor work, logo work that just happens to have outlines on it. Everything is going to require lines and line values. And it also extends out to things like shading. And I would even include things that might be considered fill stitch or value. Things like sketch stitching, which honestly, though it is using a fill stitch tool, is still really a way of using cross hatching and line value to create value in a design. I think that we can talk about a little bit of all of this. I think certainly there are some axes I have to grind as far as trying to help people disabuse themselves of some notions that are causing trouble as far as the way that they handle line. And certainly we'll bounce around a little bit. This is a topic that we have revisited many times. So if you think to yourself, I've seen that sample before, I've done this before, we've talked about this before. Of course we have, because people will be creating lines and outlines, and they will be trying to make borders register until we stop being part of the digitizing process. So frankly, there will be people talking about line value. So that's not going away. Line defining stitches in machine embroidery is a topic that I will probably visit again. This one has been about 3 years since the last time we did a full episode just on this. I will talk about things and show things you've possibly seen before, and certainly we're going to refer to other episodes. I know I have some topics that were in my recent episode about a mascot embroidery. The thing is, all embroidery boils down to certain essential truths about the physicality of a needle and thread and fabric. And once we understand that, I like to teach those essentials, those elemental parts of embroidery that get down into that level, so that once we can control the stitch, the one stitch, the single line of thread from point to point, that is the only thing an interlock sewing machine can make, which is what we are doing. We're using our interlock sewing machines with our fancy robots that move around the hoop to create something more than the sum of the stitches themselves. When we can control one stitch, and then when we can start to control the interactions between blocks of stitches, we can make anything. Does that mean that we will cover the same topics if I'm talking about patches or logo work or photographic work or animals? Eventually, yes, because all of these things are going to be based in the physicality of the needle, thread, fabric, stabilizer, machine operation, hooping tension, thread tension, and the movement of the machine. These things are the essential truths of embroidery. The distortion that happens when embroidery is done is a constant, or at the very least, if it's not a constant, it is to be expected. It might not be constant for every combination of materials, and in fact, it very much is not. But it is a constant in the fact that it is our constant companion in the world of machine embroidery, is that what happens on screen will be altered by the processes and physicality of our medium into the thing that it actually finally looks like when we're done. That's just the truth. So are we going to talk about some stuff that's universal? Yes, we are. Are we going to talk about some things you've heard before? Oh, of course we are. How many times have you talked about straight and manual stitches? Lots. But we're going to talk a little bit about how I define them and some certain things that might be interesting to you as far as technique to round out corners to make small details work better. And there's going to be some discussion of just what happens when detail is too tight. When there is too much detail, what do we do? So the second kind of corollary, aside from line defining stitches and how to deal with lines, the second thing we're going to talk about today, and I hope I can keep this to be a short show since everybody's busy and it's the holidays coming up and everything else. The second thing is talking about not just these line defining stitches, but when are we trying to put too many lines into one area? Seems like a simple thing to deal with. The problem is we get to this point where we're looking at a design and people are trying to jam satin lines deeply into little tiny spaces, and eventually you have to come to this understanding that there are certain compromises that we just can't make. Like, there will be a time where no matter what we do or compromise or think we can do to change it, thread is thread, the needle's the needle, the amount of space we have is the amount of space we have, and physicality will reign at the end of the day if we jam too many stitches into a small area, or if we don't have enough room for a satin stitch to form, or for lines to be spaced apart from each other so they can breathe, that they will climb together and be a clump and a filled area, or a knot, worse than all of that, breaking thread and breaking needles. We have to understand this physicality as the baseline for everything else. The design stuff is lovely. We love the designs to look the way we want them to look, but they can only do so under the conditions that embroidery can form. We have to be able to form the loop. The needle has to be able to get through the fabric. And in the end, it also has to be something that lays flat and looks nice and feels nice to wear. Otherwise, the point of this thing, especially as a wearable, is suspicious at best. So, like I said, have we talked about some of this stuff before? Sure, we have. We are going to talk about this stuff again. I'm going to go over the way I draw lines probably every year, about every 3 months or so. We're going to talk about how these things happen. But if every time you pick up a little something different from something I've said, something somebody else in the comments says, trust me, you're getting your money's worth, especially considering this is free. It only costs your time, and that costs the most. All right, so let's go ahead and talk to some folks. If you are on the replay squad, you know that you can fast forward and get on by. When you see the banner appear again, you know that we're back on topic. But until then, for the live folks, I like to say hi to everybody who's here. So let's go ahead and grab some comments. First, we have Frank from out in the UK. Good evening, Frank. Thank you for being here. We also have Barb coming in from Minnesota Custom Made. She says, hi, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone from North Central Minnesota. Hope you're doing all right up there. Certainly, it's frosty here in Pennsylvania, where I currently am. And so I will say, for everybody who's dealing with the nor'easter that I'm now learning how to deal with, yeah, it's chilly. It's chilly, folks. We get cold in New Mexico too, but this one's a little different for me. It's a little gray, a little windy, and a little constant. All right, we have everybody talking to each other, which I always love. Community is a big part of what we do here. Mary is in, saying good evening to everyone. Good evening, Mary. Got Lisa Shaw, my compatriot over at Embroidery, saying hi from Colorado. Hopefully she's doing all right with snows and all the things that are coming out all over there. So hi to her as well. We have everybody talking to each other. I love it. Irene's coming in, says, hello from freezing Wisconsin. Yeah, I'm sure it is. Having been to Wisconsin many times, having a lot of family out there, I'm sure it is completely cold. And we've got DJ Kev on board saying, hello, everyone from cold North Carolina. Thank you for tuning in, DJ Kev. Happy to have you here as always. Awesome contributor. We got Gail from Kingsbury Crafts coming in saying hi to everybody. Hi, Gail. Ron's in as well saying good afternoon and evening. And I know we got people all over the place. So love seeing you guys all here. Doug Sobel is in saying hi, everybody from Los Angeles. Frank's place is very wet and cold. We got Brian Bailey tuning in, creator of Embrilliance and all the wonderful tools that we use in the Embrilliance world, saying hi all. Happy Friday, Brian. Happy to have you here as well. Got Marta in from Texas saying hi. Got lots of folks talking. And then, yeah, Ron says, don't forget the humidity there, Eric. Yeah, it's there's some extra humidity and some extra snow and ice and all kinds of fun stuff. I bought my first snow shovel, which, yeah, I know we have snow in New Mexico and Albuquerque a little, but not like the deposits here where it's easy. It does happen quite a bit, though. Yeah, so it's that way, folks. For a New Mexico transplant in Pennsylvania, I'm having a time, but you know, it's a good thing to learn, right? I'm a little blistered up. If you see me talking my hands and notice I've got some new bites, those are from the snow shovel. That's from me not knowing how to pace myself. Anyway, we have Megan coming in with a lovely comment. Megan says, I'm so excited to be here. This is my first live. I always end up watching the replay on YouTube. Thank you for being here live. Happy to have you in, Megan. And also thank you for being somebody who does the replay. Like I always say, hashtag replay squad. We love the replay squad. You guys are in here and should always be asking questions in the comments. So if you are part of the replay squad, if you're not watching this on Friday, don't think I don't love you just as much as everybody else here. You are part of the crew, and by all means understand we want your questions, we want your comments, we want you to tune in. I might not get to them as fast as the folks who are on screen with me, but I will try and get to those comments. And your comments and questions very frequently form the future episodes of what I'm talking about. And maybe your social media posts. Some of you know every once in a while where you post something and you ask a question and I don't get a chance to ask you first, but suddenly your question gets answered in the take-up. That might not be as coincidental as you think. I might be watching. You never know. And Ron thinks probably my inability to pace myself with my first snow shovel is funny. I agree, man. It was not great. But yeah. All right, folks. With that, let's get on to the actual topic at hand. Let's talk about some line defining stitches in machine embroidery. And I know that's a very complicated way of saying we're going to talk about drawing lines and making them look good and some of the things that I think are interesting or necessary to understand about this stuff. Certainly, some of it's going to be, stuff you already know. It's going to be stuff that you've heard before. That's all right, because here's the thing: if you hear anything new, that's always that's always pleasant. It's always something you can learn. But even if it's not something that's brand new, getting the refresh is always good. And you may hear something you haven't heard before. You may get one kernel of things you haven't heard before, or it might just remind you of something you already knew, and that's great. So I think the thing is, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about detail quite a bit, and I think that it's interesting just to kind of go over some of these things, discuss usage, and we're going to show you some pictures. And like I said, I usually bring in some pictures, some stuff where we can discuss. We usually have some stuff in the gallery to discuss these things, because the first thing I'm going to point out with these line defining stitches is they are not for one thing, right? I'm literally talking about drawing a line. This is any way we're making a mark. And generally I'm saying lines because we're not talking about big filled areas. Yes, we might talk about satins, but we're using them in the context today of bordering, making lines. So we're going to deal a lot with like thickness and line quality and stuff like that. We're not going to talk about texturing satin stitches, how wide they are, how whatever, aside from maybe narrowness when we get down to fine line defining values. Whereas we're going to talk about straight stitches quite a bit, straight and running. That's what we would call them, depending on what software you're in. Straight or running stitches. We're going to talk about manual stitches. We're going to talk about, of course, satins and satin borders. We're going to talk about back stitches and stem stitches. We're going to talk about motif stitches. The kinds of stitches we would generally think to define a line, give it thickness and texture, right? So we're not necessarily just talking about making a line, that thickness, that texture, and also the lines can be used to represent value or sketching or shading. So all of these things are on the table for today, and I am fully on board with you saying, hey, I want to see something more about that. Give me more of that. Don't pass that by, or here's a question that I want to derail you with. That's totally fine. And so I'm going to show you just some samples that are here, and we'll just kind of go over what I mean by all that. The thing is, line can be doing any number of things. Traditionally, of course, we have some, if we had some, that's a weird thing. I clicked on a piece and another one popped up. Let's see. Hopefully, let's try that again. All right. So, of course, we are using line to do something like traditional line work. And in this case, this line work really doesn't have a lot to say about value. This is from it's an Anglo-Saxon brooch, but it is from the era that we've got some influence from the Urnest style, which is kind of a Scandinavian style. If you know that stuff, you know it. If you don't know it, you don't need to know it. What you do know, though, is in any case, this is just line work, right? I'm not trying to shade. There's no value aside from maybe line thickness. The thing you will find interesting looking at this piece is though every one of these lines is precisely 2 passes of thread. That's all it is, 2 passes of straight or running stitches. That if we look at the spine along kind of the spine of this zoomorphic animal, and it's kind of hard to see, but that big almond shape is the eye, and we can see its back and their legs and feet as we trail around its back. That spine has these circles, and we see this thickness, this additional darkness or thickness in value. What we're seeing here is that each of these circles is drawn by itself with 2 lines, and they are very, very close to the spine, the line that's the outside of the body, and then the line of the spine on the inside of the body, meaning that we have these kind of 4 lines wherever these circles are touching the outside edges, and we can see where those lines are very close together. They meld together very closely. They look like they are one line, and we get darkness. We get a thicker line. So very, very basic thing to understand, of course, is that when we have multiple lines of stitching, even straight or manual stitching, very close together, that if they are on top of each other close together, straight or manual stitches, if they are on top of each other, don't line up perfectly and disappear. They double the thickness, and if you keep on running multiple lines close together, then they are going to be thick as they are rolling off each other. They're going to be 3 lines thick. If we keep running over the same line, even if we copy and paste the same line of digitized running stitch, the stitches are going to roll off of each other. Certainly, if we place them or we run them in 2 different passes, I'm going to talk about that in a moment, we will get more thickness, more variation. But even if we copy and paste the same line right on top of each other, straight lines are going to roll off of each other. Those stitches cannot sit on top of each other. They will create additional thickness. And the more times we pass over a line, the thicker the line is. Super basic stuff, I know. But I can't tell you how many times this is the first problem people are having. They're seeing thickness somewhere that they don't understand. The second thing is, if we put two elements close together, even if they have a similar line value, these pieces here, like I said, the circles on the back are not technically touching in the digitized file to the lines that are on the back of the spine and inside the body of this little zoomorphic kind of dragon-like animal that's on this piece. But where they are touching, because they are too close together, when details are close together, they meld together. And especially with dark colored lines, and this is also if you have dark colored thread or thread with any kind of fuzz to it, or if we have any sort of deviation, in this case we're running on a twill, we're not seeing a lot of deviation, those lines are going to almost touch, and where they look like they touch, they look like additional thickness, and they are darker. And it's the same thing as density. Closer together is darker, is more value in an area. Further apart, we have daylight between them. They can stand separately and they look like separate lines. And the more space we have between them, the lighter the value. The same thing with shading. Let's say we were using lines for shading. We're going to go ahead and back up to this. Once again, we've got these lines for shading. Let's say in this dogwood, very dark. They're very close together. There's not a lot of space to breathe. Once again, every one of these lines is exactly 2 passes of running stitch. Where they are close together, they are darker. Where they are further apart, we have like these little florets in the center of this dogwood flower. They are more open. It is a lighter value. And the same thing is true of extremely detailed pieces. Like, once again, I'm clicking on an image and getting a different image. I don't know what is up with that. Here we go. But we'll zoom in a little bit on our friend from the Dion's logo here. These were punched manually, but you can see up in the hat, it's a lighter kind of shading. Once again, these are 2 passes of running stitch. That's all this is. No special stitches used, no fills being used. These are drawn by hand, and I will explain that again in a moment when we talk about passes. But we can see those lines in the cheek, it's the same type of stitching as we have in the hat. They're honestly a little too close together, and so we end up with something that looks like a fill. If we place lines close together, we will fill the area. I know that's it sounds so super basic, but one of the things that happens to people the most when they start to digitize and they're starting to try and get value out of lines or use lines for shading is they zoom in really tight. And the problem is actually not just kind of the concept of these, the concept of just getting too close for shading. It's the same concept that we have with too many details in an area and the same concept we have with too much density. Anytime we don't have room, we're filling a space. And part of the problem they zoom in really tight and try and draw every line in the original art until they end up filling an area, because the truth of the matter is the lines in the art, if we keep ourselves cognizant of the real thickness of the thread and the real size of the logo, are too close together to form without filling the area. Being super slavish to the detail is one of the first ways when we're doing this kind of manual and straight stitch work. It's the first way we end up messing up the art and getting too much detail and getting too much density and breaking thread, truthfully, as well. We get knots, we get knobs of thread, we get broken density, especially inside of eyes on people. We'll talk about that again later as well. So it's one of those things. It's like you cannot be too tight to the original detail. You must be cognizant of the space that you have available. You have to understand the scale of what you're working on. And then you have to respect the thread. The thread, the needle, the fabric, and what that means to the eventual outcome. So the thickness of the thread has to be respected. This is also why lots of people will talk to you about quality on satin stitches, especially lettering. And I'm just going to try and, just try and kind of comment real quickly on this and not go too far off into satin stitches or lettering, because we can do a lettering episode again later. Like I said, we'll be doing a lettering episode probably once every 3 months or 6 months, something like that, no matter what. People will tell you, oh, it looks weird, just switch to 60 weight thread. Think for a moment about why you would do that materially. 60 weight thread is about 25% thinner than 40 weight thread. There's not always a good reason to switch to 60 weight thread. 60-weight thread on the right surface allows you to add some more density, and we have smaller penetration points. And we can also make smaller, because we're using a smaller needle and we've got small penetration points, and we're not going to drop the needle in the same spot twice. We can do smaller satin stitches, narrower satin stitches, smaller openings and holes, provided the texture of the fabric will let us do it. So why do people switch to 60-weight thread for small lettering? It doesn't just magically make things look more fine. Sometimes if a digitizer is using too much density in their design, 60-weight thread will clear problems up because the 40-weight thread is too thick for the area, or they've gone so small in their lettering that the needle is literally falling into the same spot. Like maybe we're talking about the hole in the center of a letter. The needle is hitting the same spots over and over, and we are just punching thread into the middle because we can't actually, the thickness of the needle is not being accounted for in the spacing of the design. Then 60-weight thread seems like magic. The problem is usually they probably haven't set the densities to that extra 25% for coverage, and you might get weird sparse coverage or a little bit of edge quality problems. So the thing we have to quit doing is thinking of these things as magic. This isn't magic. This is measurable. It is scientific. It is something we can control. These are factors we have under our control. And the thing is, when people kind of just throw out, "Oh, your lettering looks bad. 60-weight thread. I don't know. Change this. Change that." But the thing is, we should stop and say, why do we change that? And there is a physical reason why we change that, and we can see it in the stitch out. If I'm talking about that piece again that I just showed you, which a lot of people feel is a successful piece, right? Well, Dion's Pizza Man, you guys have seen this one a million times because I show it a lot. It's one of my earlier pieces. Plus, the stitches in our pizza friend were actually punched manually back in the day. So I did that with an older piece of software. I actually added lettering in a newer piece of software later because the original lettering wasn't as nice as this. You can retool old designs, believe it or not, in different software. I've done it a million times. Ask me how. But the thing is, these lines were all punched manually. But when I look at it myself, I'm going to tell you from the original art that my values are a little too dark in the face. The shading's a little too dark. It's not exactly where I wanted it to be. The eyes are a little dark, not terrible. We've got a little dark corner of the eye that shouldn't be quite that dark. And how did I mess that up? What is the thing that I did incorrectly? It's exactly what I just described to you. It is getting too close, zooming in too far, trying to draw every line and not being cognizant of the overall value, not respecting my own tests of how far apart lines have to be in order to create a value. And I drew a little too close. So what I ended up doing is this little area on the cheek, though the texture is a little more interesting. Let's say I'll draw in, my camera's reversing me, so I gotta like show you. It's more like a mirror here. If I'm looking at that side of his face that's here, well, the truth of the matter is, though the texture is nice, it's essentially a satin or a fill. It's entirely filled. There's not a lot of daylight in there. There should be more. It's a little too dark. Yes, it has a fairly dark value in the art, not as dark as what I have here. It's because I've drawn too much detail in, and I wasn't respecting the fact that the thread had thickness. Now, I will be honest with you. If you took just that section, not the rest of it, because not everything is in a poor value. If I put 60-weight thread right there, provided I'm on this lovely apron material, which is like a polyester twill, really, it's about the same as a patch material. If I took that apron and ran 60-weight thread on it, it would lighten up that little shade on his cheek. Why? The thread is thinner, and 2 passes of that thread is less thick than 2 passes of the 40-weight thread, meaning it would open up a little bit. The spacing would open up, and I'd get a lighter value for the shading. I know that there are people here right now who are like, yeah, I've drawn with a pen before. I know what stitches are. I know how that works. But I cannot tell you how many times I see somebody who is doing their first work or their journeyman work. They've done some good work, but they're trying to take on more detail. And they start to get really frustrated. The eyes of their characters are breaking thread and breaking needles, and everything's puckering, and it looks terrible, and it's getting dark. And they haven't realized that what they're doing is zooming in at 6,000%, drawing every single line with every single point on that line in extreme detail. And then when they pull back out to the real world of how big the needles and thread are, especially if they're working with standard 40 weight, they've just chowdered in a fill or a wonky satin as hard as they could with massive amounts of needle penetrations in one space, and often very short stitches because they're dropping hard point nodes or nodes that are causing needle drops several times along these very short lines. It's about working at scale. It's about understanding that physicality. And so here's the thing with line defining stitches, whether you are working manual, whether you're working with straight stitch in this kind of way, remember that as you put stitches together, no matter what tool you're using, you are creating something that will fill the space with color. You will make marks. And as you get closer together, you get darker values. As you get further apart, you get lighter. If you have trouble figuring that out, the best thing you can do is draw some swatches, do some swatch testing, and show yourself how far apart doubled lines of stitching need to be to get the value you want. People are going to say, hey, I've got art. The art has lines on it. I'm trying to get that art to be on this piece. Gotcha. The thing is, there is just a world in which, especially I've done pocket-sized versions of this guy. You want to believe me that there are definitely not all the same lines in the face that there were at the jacket back size. And it looks similar, but I've taken out maybe half or more of the lines. Why? Because you just cannot use lines to create value and expect that when I compress them all down into a smaller space, that same number of lines creates the same value when I haven't changed the thickness of the line. That's the thing. We have to understand that the thickness of the thread is a constant, and then we got to work on that piece. So you just walk in through those pieces. And like I said, double pass is where I start. And I am going to try and explain that stuff. And I do have a couple questions here, and there's actually some good questions. So for sure, I'm going to talk about that. First, I will say we have a couple funny things too, so I'll go ahead and say that too. Doug says, that's what a snowblower is for, Eric. I do not have enough space for a snowblower, man. I got like a sidewalk. I just need to be a better scraper and be better about my gloves too. Let's talk about that. We use the plow and the bobcat if needed. No, thank you. I'm too far. Start me off easy, just like Doug says. All right, we have another comment. It's a little more on term. Then we'll have some good questions that are coming up here too. Michelle says, I just recently saw a video you did talking about edge pad showing and saw that you said make your inset at least at 7 resolve 98% of my problems. Yeah, that's another one. To go slightly off, what Megan is talking about here is that when you have a satin stitch set of lettering with edge run underlay or contour underlay, however it's called, people frequently will have a little bit of variation in their stitch out. And if they don't have pull compensation on, or if they haven't set their inset, you'll see borders, lines of stitches outside of your lettering or off to one side of your lettering. And frequently what it is just you haven't inset your underlay. So imagine our satin stitches here. This is my edge underlay, and this is right under the edge. Well, if it's right under that edge and you're seeing underlay stitches outside of your column, increase your inset, set them further in from the edge, and you're going to find you're going to be a happier person overall. You don't lose them because we still have some nice coverage between the stitches and the edges, but we do end up with a little more breathing room. And also, by the way, if your satin stitch isn't quite as thick as you want it to be, then the other thing you can do is increase your pull comp. Why? Because it just moves those edges out, and your satin, your edge run will still be in the same place it was. So two things you can do: increase your pull comp or increase your inset. So either draw your edge runs in or increase your pull comp, and it extends those stitches and makes them wider so that when they thin out, they're not going inside of where the edge run's supposed to be, and you're not having the same sort of thickness issues. If things are getting super, super thin, obviously pull comp is the way. Pull comp is what? Lengthening stitches. That's what pull compensation is. We use words like pull compensation or push compensation or push distortion, pull distortion, but we could get simpler and say, yeah, pull comp, what does it do? Makes stitches longer in a block. That's what pull comp does. If you have pull comp that can be set to one edge or another, I'm like, makes the left side more, makes the right side more. Lengthens stitches. That's what it does. If our column of satins is here, we add pull comp, they get wider. That's it. And we know that they always get thinner when they run. We're just compensating for the natural stresses of embroidery. But I'm super happy it helped, for real. It's something, like I said, it's a thing that sometimes people just don't expect. Or when you're starting out in embroidery, or even if you're just starting out with new software, you might think, hey, the software is just always going to work. It's going to set for a default. Software doesn't know where your default is unless you set it. And honestly, you also may just have some sort of material differences going on in your machine, or speed, or running times, or something with your hooping. If your first stitch out shows you having problems with something, go back and correct by the distance that it's missing. That's really what it is. If it's your stitches are this far outside your column, tuck them in further than that, further than the gap, and now you're good. It's one of those things. But yeah, that setting is kind of where I'm at. 7 and 8 is pretty common for me. All right, so a couple other questions here. Iran says, and this is true, I'm going to talk about this in a second, one pass in, the other pass out on any line. And he says, I alternate my nodes. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Alternating stitch penetrations to get nice curves and things. I do the same thing. So we'll talk about that in a moment. DJ Kev has a good question. So we're still on straight stitches and running stitches. Honestly, that's where a lot of this stuff is. I am also going to briefly talk about registration with those as well, just to kind of make a point. Does the stitch length make a difference in this line work? Yeah, surely. Longer stitches, yes, they look less broken. Certainly, longer stitches look less broken to a degree. They will rise a little higher if we're thinking of the stitch rising out of the material, like a little dolphin jumping across the waves. If we have these stitches that are rising out of the material, the longer they are, the more lofty they are. The shorter they are, they tend to pull a little tighter. They're under tension. They tend to be a little tighter. So if we want them tighter, shorter stitches are tighter. Also for traveling stitches, or if you're trying to hide something under something else, go with shorter stitches. They ride tighter to the surface of the material, and they're easier to hide. But conversely, the other thing to think about is longer stitches look less broken. Smaller stitches can look pebbly because they have more penetration points, and every time there's a penetration point, there's a little shadow. The other thing to talk about with this is color. It was something I was going to talk about later, but it's just as good to talk about it now. Straight stitches that are in a dark color, straight or running stitches in a dark color, tend not to look very broken, right? They look pretty good. They look pretty solid. Once you start doing them in a lighter color, they're going to look more broken. Even if they look good and clean, they're going to look more broken because of the shadow that appears at the penetration points. With lighter colors, you're going to see that as you make shorter stitches, yes, there's a texture there, and that's the thing. You'll have to decide where that texture is important to you, but shorter stitches are going to look very pebbly, very broken, very dotted, whereas a longer stitch might not. But the only problem with that is with the longer stitches and the light colors in straight stitch or running stitch applications, the shadows can be very, very prominent. You'll see those shadows. In fact, I'm going to bring you up a couple of examples of that just to make that clear here. Stitch length and certainly color are a big deal. So yeah, stitch length can make a difference. In this case, we're looking at this patch here that has once again, double straight stitch, double running border. And I can show you this patch in the file as well if we want to. We can do that too. But this piece right here, double running border, but it's in gold on black. In gold on black, you are absolutely going to see that this thing's got shadows, right? It looks pebbly. It looks a little broken. Not a problem, not a bad thing. It's just something to understand that you can't avoid this. The shadow will be there. There is no making a straight stitch on a dark garment with a light color that is not going to look stitchy or broken. Unfortunately, and here I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to file through some slides I was going to show you later, but I'm going to see if I can give you an example of something that I always bring up. It's a piece that they liked, they worked with, they kept from us at the shop that I was at, and I'm just going to show you briefly. I've got some other stuff in this deck that I'll probably show you in a minute on this same topic, but I wanted to give you this one sample. If I can get to it fast. There it is. We'll bring up this one sample so you can see it, and I'll just make this ultra clear. This is a design that was reverse, right? Originally, we were on another garment. I think we had black garments with a red dragon, because we know the Welsh dragon is traditionally red, with a red dragon, but they decided they wanted to reverse this out and have black dragon on red garments with white borders. And the unfortunate truth is, no matter what you do to this, you are going to see stitchy lines. No matter your method, if you do light colored thread for straight stitch or running stitch applications, and you'll see especially where, and I'm going to point this out, especially where we have these lines here where they are lining up the stitch penetration points between the two lines. And I usually try and alternate. In this case, I didn't alternate the penetration points very well. You can see actually down here where there is more alternation, where the stitch penetration points from the two different runs of the thread have not lined up, that it looks a little more solid down in the feet. But up here in the wing, where I did not do, I guess, my due diligence here to try and break it up. Well, and honestly, because here's the thing. I did this in black. When I originally did this with black outlines on a red dragon, that did not look broken like this. It's when it was reversed in the production department without, my approval on this sucker, that it was done this way. It was reversed out in colors, and we end up with this broken look. It's not necessarily the end of the world. Embroidery looks like embroidery. It is like this. It can be stitchy. That is what it is. No matter what your method is, light colored thread is going to look sketchy or stitchy like this if you do these threads. I will say that this one, what will also happen though, this will reveal all the flaws. I'm looking at this piece right now and realizing that over here in the tail, we've got a little bit of deviation that's just enough to show some color between it. And in the black thread, it doesn't show that. In the black thread, even though it was on white and red garments, the contrast just doesn't look so bad. Over here, I'm looking at the edge of this tail, and where this was run, maybe it's a little bit of shifting that happened on this individual piece, but we've got a little bit of gap here that I think probably doesn't look too bad at 3 feet, but is something that I would definitely have corrected on an edit if I were given the chance to. It's not necessarily a problem, but what I will say, you can see also in the stitch lengths, the longer stitches look a little less broken, but the shadows, especially where the penetration points line up, are more pronounced. So the shorter stitches look maybe a little pebbly, but they look a little less prominent, these loops. And you can also see how the loops stand up higher in the longer stitches, whereas we look at some of the shorter stitches that are going around the curves, some of the shorter stitches in the feet, like I said, they do look a little bit more cohesive and tight, where some of these longer stitches are kind of sitting up on the surface. And what I'll say is, when you're doing something and you never think it's going to be in a reverse color, or you're never going to run it like that, in the black, this doesn't look bad. In the black, this is not a problem. And the original stitch out looked great, and we ran it for quite some time until they decided to reverse it. And frankly, even in the reverse, they liked this piece. The customer took this piece and was happy as a clam. They got what they wanted and felt happy about it. When I look at it, I'm going to tell you it looks fairly broken, and there's some things I would change for an ideal representation. If I was trying to make this look its best, there are things I could do to make this, to my eye, a little better, a little more solid. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Shorter stitches look more pebbly. Longer stitches look a little less broken. The other thing to think about is that when you're going around a curve, the longer stitches you have are going to look more polygonal unless you do some offsetting. And we'll talk about that also real quick. In fact, I think I'll bring that up. I'll just go ahead and talk about this really quickly, guys. So we were talking about the way we digitize for this. I might as well go ahead and just start it now and kind of discuss that just briefly, because we had a comment earlier. And I think it was Doug who was talking about that too. He said, or no, Ron said it, 1 pass in, 1 pass out, alternating nodes. I'm going to talk about that as well. But let's go ahead and really quickly go through the comments, and then we'll jump into tour digitizing real quickly, which is just kind of how you manage those lines. And then we'll kind of back out and we'll see where we are for kind of moving on from this topic to the next kind of section. But let's go ahead and say hi to some folks who are here, and certainly get a couple more comments before we get into that. But yeah, DJ Kev, hopefully that made a little bit of sense. We will talk a little bit more stitch length in the context of the other stuff we're talking about here, but certainly loft is one of the big qualifications. And then, like I said, especially in light colors, the pebbliness, the brokenness can be affected by how short or how long those are. All right. So yeah, Doug has a comment, which I fully agree. Pet peeve of Facebook groups. People don't explain why they are suggesting something. Yeah. The underlying physicality of the thing, the mechanism, since I talk a lot with my doctor wife about these things, there's a mechanism by which things work in the body. And that's another thing I like to use that same term. The mechanism by which these things are working on the embroidery should be discussed and understood for sure. And yes, lots of factors in troubleshooting when things are going on, says Barb. So yes, absolutely. And we have, I Gay Paris Jr. says, hi there, digitizing fam. Hi, how's it going? And hello from VA, finally kind of live. The newish time frame, same time frame turns out, same time frame. Just I'm in the East now, so it's a little weird. And yes, thank you. Don't forget to like and subscribe, please. Share it with your friends. We like to have more people here for sure. All right, folks. So let's go ahead and go on to the other things. Yeah, and Joanne says because light colors reflect more. Kind of. Yes and no. Yes. Light colors, because they reflect more, have more contrast where we have the penetration points. Think about the penetration point where 2 stitches come together, where you're seeing the 2 stitches or 1 stitch end and then the stitch start, and it's sinking in. Well, in this little divot, we're getting a shadow, and that shadow is dark, and the stitching up here is light. If the color up here is dark, if it's a black thread or a dark colored thread, the contrast between the dark shadow and the lightest area of the thread is less. Certainly, it's even more so with let's say matte finish threads or a fuzzy thread, it's even less because you're right. Reflection is also part of that. That specular highlight, the reflection on the top of that thread. But light colors, because of the shadow that exists right here, you can see the shadow forming between my fingers. I know I talk my hands a lot physically, but you see the little shadow that's forming between my fingers as the light disappears down in there. That's the same thing that's happening with the threads. We have a little shadow at every penetration point. We have to think about thread in a three-dimensional way as the thing that we're actually making, this relief sculpture of thread, and not as printing. It's not ink. It's not sitting on top of our surface. It's going through it. It's piercing down into it. And when we do that, we get those reflections. It's a three-dimensional object. Light is reflecting nicely off the top of this curve of the stitch. As it goes down into the shadow, it's getting darker. That color value gets darker. On dark colors, the contrast between the high and the low is less, so we just don't see as much of it. Do you still see pebbliness? Absolutely. Do you still see brokenness? Let me see if I can just bring up another outline. There's entire possibility that I can kind of show you that too. You will see, especially with polyester thread that has shine to it, you're going to see a difference between those things, especially if we have a color that has a little bit more to it, a little bit more contrast to it. Here's a portion of a car. There's a piece for Al Unser Jr. I did a jacket back for him and a shirt back for him. We'll go ahead and bring this up again. This is the original piece, and there's the car from that piece. And as we're looking at it, you can see with this navy, there is highlight. You can see there's some highlight in the satin on our tire here. So even this dark navy, and what we can see when we start to zoom in really tight, or even if I go, and let me see if I've got a detail shot so I can get even tighter on it. Let's zoom in really, really tight. Let's get down to the essence of the stitch, like I keep talking about. We can see on these stitches that there is a highlight on the crown of the stitch, and as we sink into the fabric, there's a little shadow. If I zoomed all the way in on that, you would notice that there's a little specular highlight at the top of each of these stitches, the same with our satin stitches. It's why we have that lovely shine, unlike polyester and rayon threads that have a high sheen. But you can see here, even as we're looking at this, because I'm taking a picture of it with a little bit of a vertical, it's like this is sitting up on an angle when I'm taking the picture and the light source is coming down from above it. You can see that there is a dark shadow under the stitch. There's a light highlight toward the top of the stitch because the light is coming down from the top and the stitch is curving out of the fabric. Even on this is a red cap work shirt. So this is a really flat material. I believe that's a poplin or something. Somebody who knows better about fabric weaves can school me if you want to. I will take it. But yeah, there is certainly a highlight toward that top edge of that individual stitch. If I zoom in on little individual stitches, there's a highlight there, there's a shadow there. And yes, even on a dark color like dark navy, there is some variation. However, we compare this variation to the kind of variation you're going to see on any sort of, light color. In fact, this is done with contour stitching, we see all the shadows that are appearing in these contour columns in the Balloon Fiesta piece that I did. Now this is on denim, so the background is kind of messing with us a little bit, but we can see all the brokenness in the red, in the orange. Those lines don't look nearly so broken. The yellow, though they stand out better on the denim, look more broken and they look more stitchy, more underdeveloped because of that shine in the shadow, right? Though I am going to also say this is a matte finish thread here for the orchards, and I'll show the fun one that has the dime in it so you can see how small this piece is. With that matte finish thread, the overall shininess, yes, there's a highlight, but the shine and shadow and the solidness of the outcome here is much more uniform because of the lack of super high specular shine on the top of those suckers in comparison to the shadow. Do I still see a shadow? Yeah. If we look at the bottom of this roof here, once again, this is taken. You can see because of the drop shadow on our dime here, we have light that's kind of coming down in. And I'll try and use the directions correctly for you on the screen. We have light coming down from this corner, and where the light's coming down from that corner, what we can start to see is as this light streams down from this corner, hopefully you can see my mouse cursor moving a little bit. As it comes down from this upper left corner, we see this highlight on the roof here. We see a shadow on the inside of this satin, and we can see a little shadow on the edge of the roof. That texture is there, but we can see in these lines, because of how solid and how little shine there is on the matte finish thread, if the thing that was important to us was to get solid line values, that matte finish thread gives a much more solid line value with straight stitch or running stitch art. I mean, don't get me wrong, you still get really solid line values from dark colors. This is 75 weight thread. 75 weight thread, and we'll talk about this little piece later and its little eyes and details. Once again, we'll zoom in real hard. We'll enhance and enhance. This is on a dress shirt. So the texture, that's the texture of the shirt, believe it or not. It looks like canvas. It is not. It is very smooth. This is 75 weight thread, and that is, yes, indeed, a real 2015 dime. These lines, as you can still see, though, you see the little specular highlights, those little shines on there? This is super, super dark navy thread. Incredibly dark navy thread. We still can see the highlights and shadows, but when it's dark enough, line value starts to get pretty solid, right? Line value starts to get pretty darn solid on dark enough materials, dark enough threads. Whereas if we have light thread of any kind, no matter how we're doing it, I mean, this top notch is such a great experience for that one. You see that it looks dotted. It looks dotted or dashed. Great outline, hits the edges just right. The registration is perfect on this piece, not a problem. It does its job, but it is going to look more broken. There is no simple cure for light colors. I will say there are some things, and we are going to talk about them again in a moment here, and I'm going to show this piece. This piece has a backstitch in a light gold. Now, admittedly, the background color certainly does something for this too, but you see, because we have offset overlapped runs of these stitching where the penetration points tuck in against the sides of the other stitches in this backstitch for backstitching, we actually end up with less brokenness, though we do have a little bit of jaggedness on the edge, especially in tight corners. Pardon me, I've grabbed the wrong thing in as I'm trying to illustrate. We can see that, like I said over here, because we do still have shadow at the edge of each one of these stitch groupings, and I've got very tight images of this, so I'll try and show you this image as tight as I can and get you some of these back stitches. Here we go. We can really start to see the back stitch, right? The formation of the back stitch, because it makes this stitch cluster, this repeated stitch cluster, and then jumps down and up into the next group of back stitches, it offsets that penetration point. And even in this light gold color, you don't see quite the same kind of brokenness when you zoom out. The problem being is because we do lay these groups of stitches next to each other at an angle, there is a bit of a sawtoothed or rough or pixelated jaggedness to a back stitch that you don't get with a double run, right? So it's not like a double running stitch. And as we get really tight into a corner, you can see that sometimes there's some weird variation, both with stitch length and with the angles that can happen depending on how your back or stem stitch is put together. But yeah, it does offset. Now, once again, I've got nice tight pictures of these. You can see how we are offsetting the stitch penetration points. And I'll go ahead and, for the people who are watching this on replay later, they'll probably be happy to see what we're talking about. Yeah, this is where we're talking about like back stitches and stem stitches. The back stitch or the stem stitch does have this ability to create thickness by letting us repeat the individual stitch blocks, and then it offsets that stitch penetration point a little bit, which makes for less of that kind of darkness you might see. The problem is it's pretty thick, and we have to travel to make these things, and it's not exactly something you're going to be able to do on every design. And as we get into tight curves, some weirdness can happen depending on your software and stitch type. For back and stem stitch, as far as that angular overlap, you can get some jaggedness and some sawtoothing. In a design where it's gold on gold like this, I'm not going to see much trouble. If I put this to the white on black test, you might be a little unhappy. Here we have this piece, and that has a back stitch. I believe, back stitch on this one. We've got some stem stitch coming up into this curve here. You can see some weirdness that happens as I get into this tight curve. But we can see what it looks like with a thick, this is a 12 weight wool blend thread. This is Madeira Burma is the specific wool blended 12 weight. But once again, we can see how that back stitch, and this is in a lighter color and a darker garment. It does indeed look a little less broken further out, but we get some edge quality that we may or may not love, right? So these are the trade-offs we always have. Anytime we're using line following stitches that trace along a line that have penetration points. So we can talk about back and stem stitch. We can go back, and we will talk a little bit more about laying out our straight manual stitches again. And something I've talked about, but we're going to talk about how we digitize these again. But whenever we have a line following stitch like those, that it tracks along a line, right? Whenever we have that, the things we're always having to deal with are how do we handle the penetration points? If we drop penetration points in the same spot over and over again, they will get darker and darker, and they will be more visible, and sometimes we'll see the hole through the fabric. We are dealing with the effects of length, as DJ Kemp pointed out and asked about. And we are dealing with when we start going around a curve, what we have to remember is stitches are only straight. So we may have a little tight curve. I'm going to talk about this in a second. You have a little tight curve. Well, the problem is that as we go around the tight curve, if we have long stitches, we can only achieve it through like a polygon of straight lines that go around our curve. We don't have curved stitches. They don't exist. There is no curvature to a stitch. It's a straight line between 2 points under tension. It cannot be anything but a straight line. So as we go around a curve, we can see angular corners and things pop up because we don't have curvature. There is no curvature. It's a series of straight lines. And how most people handle that in most softwares or in their own digitizing is by making much shorter stitches to track around the curve. But as you know, shorter stitches means what? More penetration points, more shadows, and a more broken appearance, and a change in the overall look of the line from longer stitches outside of the curve. So we have to contend with what we're doing there. Like I said, it really is interesting. It really is interesting how that goes. And by the way, thank you, Barb. That's very nice to say. So that's pretty nice. Easy to put holes in that type of fabric. Yeah, that is a double layer. I will cotton to that. It's a double layer of that tulle fabric, but it is also like the cheapest acrylic netting tool that I've ever had. Like, it's cheap. It's just a plain thing. They were table runners. We had at my wedding. We had so many extras that I still use them for projects. Plus, I do love the look of that gold. Old gold for me, light old gold is like touches my soul. The one that I remember this from my early career because it's my favorite. Everybody says, "What's your favorite color?" And I'm like, I don't have a favorite color. I have a favorite thread color though, and it's Madeira Rayon 1070. Especially gold on green. That is just a lovely combination that I always like. Gold on green, gold on gold. And I'm not a gold jewelry kind of guy. I like silver colors and light colors for metals mostly. But that is a thread that was just always a stunner for me. So yeah, light old gold is just a friend of mine. But yeah, I will go ahead and say thank you for the compliment on that. I do like that little piece. And I also love this. This is great. A piece for the history of embroiderings too. I want to show you this real quickly again, just for the heck of it. The other thing to notice about this piece that's interesting is I was testing out some work with our original satin engine here too. So if we look through this, the type of stitch that's in this Lombardic capital, and yes, that's what the term is for this guy. This Lombardic kind of manuscript capital E that we're seeing here has a lovely stitch with texture in the back of the kind of back curvature of this bowl of the spine. That, speaking of line values and line types, that is a satin stitch with a length limit stitch specific to brilliance with a high edge padding. So a high edge padding value and a length limit stitch gives you something very satin-like with a little bit of texture with your column tool. If you are in other softwares, you'll see similar things, and I can show you something similar because I've got some of these older designs from other software. This is an auto split, and you see a more regular, perhaps, channel through here, but it's not broken. And that's what you're going to see in like Wilcom. What you'll see with us is a length limit, which is slightly different. And this is a really lovely example of the length limit stitch in a very low density satin on this tool. So lovely, lovely piece. And something interesting that just happens to fit in with our theme of columns as making lines. And as we can see here, once again, we see our densities. We can see how density affects solidness. Pardon me, I'm clicking the wrong screen again. We can see how density affects solidness of the edge. We can see how edges interact. And once again, what I love about these super high zoom in, high resolution images, we start to see interactions between fabric and thread and the number of holes you put in it. I will say, certainly I've got some Rosalies here that are made of overlapped satins. These are a little too dense, and I can tell they're a little too dense looking at them. They're causing a little additional stress, but my leaves look nice. This lovely length limit satin stitch break looks lovely. It's a piece that did actually turn out pretty nice. But what I will say is interesting is this, like I said, the line value. The line value is a nice, thick, defined line that you can also travel under, because you can see I'm stopping and traveling in this piece. I had to actually stop here, travel out to my end with a running stitch, short stitches underneath this stem stitch, and hide it on the way back across. And yes, so what you're not seeing here, hidden under this branch is actually very short running stitches underneath much longer back stitches. So if you need to hide stitches, make them short. Like I said, make them short, travel underneath. I don't trim on this piece. There's no trimming here. There's no trimming in baseball. I don't know. It's a bad quote. There's no trimming that goes on here. If I've got something that's solid, no, there's one trim. There's one trim to jump to the letter that I did cut. Everything else, no trimming. If stuff is touching, I don't trim. I try not to. I travel. So we have very short running stitches used as travel stitches that actually run underneath this stem to the end and then come back. Then we come back with our stem stitch across this, or our back stitch, and continue on in that way. And I think this is back stitch. I'll show you back and stem stitch in a minute, but I would like to get back to the tours before we do that. And I think we'll kind of move on from there. We won't go too far. I think we're not going to get into a ton of satin stuff. I think we've kind of talked about some of the stuff we need to understand, because I think really this concept of detail density, and I know I've talked about it many times before, but of not jamming too much into space and understanding the physicality of the needle. I'm going to I get to show you a couple more images about that I know I've shown before, to bring home the point of stitch formation, having satin stitches be as wide as they need to be to run. I will try and show you the tapered satins again toward the end here again that we did from the mascot show to kind of bring that home. But I do want to get back into the tours and the straight stitches, because I've had a couple people I've shown in the last week the concept of touring in and touring out of a line, and why I do it the way I do it, that we're kind of had some epiphany moments about why their lines look the way they do. And I want to share that with you guys in case any of you are in the same boat. Irene says the high inset. If you're I don't know if you're talking about the inset of the underlay we were talking about earlier, because that was seven embroidery points for the inside of the underlay earlier. If you're talking about the edge pad, I'd have to look on that particular design, but I mean like 2 millimeters. Like I want to have a nice satin like edge, probably like a 2 mil inset. I really want to have a pretty far inset on that piece. You're always trying to get the balance between having so much inset that you get like a place where the stroke splits directly in half, because we don't want to look like a split satin, but we do want to keep because what edge padding does, if you don't know this, in the length limit stitch setting, is it just prevents, if I have a stroke here that's a satin line that I'm trying to define a satin column, edge padding prevents the edges of the satin column from having stitch penetration points in them, and it just moves kind of an invisible line in where it says, no, sir, from this point to the edge, we're not going to allow any penetration points. I believe it was pretty high, like 2 mils on that piece. But I also changed that inset value depending on the thickness of my stroke, and depending on how the stroke tapers, thins, and does a thin and thick pass, because I want to see how it's going to affect different thicknesses along the line of the stroke. But I do tend to use a high inset value. A really low inset value, a default inset value as it starts, is like 0.4 mils. That's a normal value. You don't really want a penetration point within that 0.5 millimeter of the edge of that at all, no matter what pattern you're using on a column. But I use a much higher value, definitely over 1 millimeter, and I'm talking about like 2 mils. So there's a 2 millimeter satin zone on the outside edge of these things where it won't drop a penetration point. So hopefully that makes sense. Play with the tooling, look at the texture, turn on and off your point values as well. And I think that's all worthwhile, right? So that's all worthwhile to look at. Play with it. The other best thing you can do, make a letter that's a lovely letter you enjoy. Make a letter in a style that you like. Put that length limit value on it at a big size and maybe a smaller size and a larger size, and make a few different passes of that thing. Look at it on screen first and decide, see if you can see it enough there. And if you can't, get that sucker on the machine, use some light colored thread so it actually over accentuates those penetration points, those shadows, and then you can see what that texture is going to look like. I mean, nothing beats the machine. Being on the machine is always going to be the end all be all for understanding how this stuff works. Nothing means anything until it's in the thread. As you guys know, for me, I'm usually that guy. Stitches or it didn't happen. All right. So yeah, that's what I would say for testing on that. Let's go back once again. Like I said, I want to talk very briefly about the tour digitizing. I know we've covered this before. If it's new to you, then I'm super happy you're here. If it's old to you, hey, maybe there's something in here that you haven't seen before or something to think about, but it's worth covering in the, kind of under the aegis of this topic, certainly. So let's go ahead and grab our screen share here, and we'll see if my head is in the way of any of this. Hopefully not, because because I'd love to keep it large so you can see what I'm talking about. Certainly, I'll move my head out of the way of this piece real quickly just to show you tour digitizing for straight stitch lettering is one of those places where it really does make a lot of sense to think about digitizing tours. And certainly in this case, when I talk about a tour, what I mean is whenever I encounter a line, and this is also when we're talking about other kinds of super detailed borders and straight stitch work and single color work, that you start at the beginning point of a line, go out to a perceived endpoint or a place where you want to stop, and then tour back across that line. So if we're kind of watching my cursor here, and like I said, I'm having a little bit of trouble with my cursor software, so it hasn't been doing the cursor highlighting. I really need to install something new. If we see my cursor kind of moving, this is very small text. We're talking about sub 3 mils. Yes, 40 weight thread. If I was trying to make straight stitch, very small, clean, clear text, first you're going to see that I'm leaving some nice open space, but you'll see that the tour goes out to the end of a word and then back to the beginning of the word. In this case, let's say that I am jumping out from some other element. I'm starting at the top of this I in the word images. I will, number one, I'm also going to tell you I will often do this manually, or I will use hard nodes, line nodes to define my my lines so that I can control exactly where the needle's going to drop. So that's something to understand. Then I'm going to just tell you that I'm doing this tour where I'm dropping my points. I go down here to the bottom of the I, across the M. We're not going to break these apart or trim them because any tie-off stitches inside of a straight stitch word are going to look like a giant knot. So we can't really do that. We don't want to tie off. We jump down to the middle of this M, up to the top. We're punching a stitch in the middle of this line because this is, maybe 1 to 1.5 millimeters, probably a little less. Like I said, sub 3 millimeter text. So we're dropping down here. We have a very short stitch over the A, across the top. We define the bottom of the G. We go over the bottom of the E. We hit a point here so we can jump over the S. Those little short stitches between the letters tend to make them sink a little bit. They will be visible, but they will be less prominent. And then we go around our S across to the end. And then we draw again because we might offset just a little bit. I'll talk about that in a moment. We draw the next one back across the top of the S. We go ahead and finish the S. We go back to the bottom here. As we head up to the middle, we jump over into the middle and back out. We jump up to the top, over, back down. We go to our G. We go to complete the line into the center of the G. We finish the bottom, up to the top, across, back down. We have our A. We didn't finish that center bar, so as we get up to the middle, we jump across with our center bar. We go over, finish our A, go across all the lines of the M, and back out to the top of the I. That is tour digitizing. Tour into our endpoint, tour back out across each line, and don't deviate. Why? If you make 3 lines over one spot and 1 line over another, where you have 1 line of stitching will be light and thin, where you have 3 lines will be heavier than the rest. Line thickness, line value, or darkness, boldness is established by how many passes we go across each line. So that's tour digitizing in a nutshell. Go to the end, turn back, tour the line. And the thing is, engraving style pieces or outlines, no matter what it is, it's still tour style digitizing. If I'm on the side of this face for this wolf on this back patch, I'm going to tour in from the edge of the piece, go around the eye up to the eyebrow, back to the eye, finish the eye, go back around the eye, go up here, down to the line to the center of the nose, up, across, and then back. And I'm going to find a place where I can stop, and then I'm going to come back. It doesn't always mean it's not connecting to another part of the line work. You can come back from another side. You can come back from another area. It's just something to remember that as we go through lines, we need to be very cognizant of it. But it is easy as we're traveling like up the edge of a piece to say, okay, when I encounter, very much like putting your right hand on the wall of a maze and then following your hand along the wall until you eventually get out, right? As long as you don't take your hand off the wall and you keep coming back, it's, you make the tour. Well, every time I encounter a branch, I go down the branch until I reach the end of the branch, and then I tour back to my junction point. And if there's another branch, then I go out to the end of that branch, and then I tour back to the junction point where I turned. Come to the fork in the road, tour to the end, come back to the fork, tour out to the end. And if I end there, I come back to that fork and then come back the way I came. Tour out to the end of each pass, tour back in. And yeah, lots of people, honestly, this is an old school digitizing method. This is how you make sure you don't make mistakes on these pieces. I'm going to talk about the small curves in a second, but we do have a couple comments, which is worthwhile. Learned that from Lee Caraselli Barnes. Yeah, absolutely. She would teach that. Old school punchers are going to teach that. Everybody should teach that. That is the way we keep it in mind to make sure our thicknesses are even. Also, the other thing to remember is if we are traveling in a line, so let's say we are traveling in a straight line, um, the stitch count or the number of lines across an area will also kind of tell you the direction of travel. If we're trying to get back to the original start point, well, if we go 1, then we have to go 2. Now we can get back. Even numbers are going to head back to where we are. If we do 3 now, we are now going the other direction again. Now we're going forward again. And the same thing is true when we think of our multi-pass stitches. So if you use a bean stitch, why are bean stitches in odd numbers and start from 3? Why? Because it's 1, 2, 3, still heading forward. 1, 2, 3, still heading forward, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, still heading forward. Whereas if it was 4, it would head the other direction, right? That is how it is, right? It is just the thing. This is how you don't go over top of things too far and how you determine your thickness and your direction of travel. So that's why bean stitches work the way they do too. Honestly, that's the thing to remember. This is how it is. And honestly, all of these things come together just to understand a stitch is a certain value of thickness. They don't sit on top of each other, or at least not very accurately when they're right on top of each other in a line. So if you run multiple passes, that thickness will increase. And if we have different values of numbers of passes on lines, they will have different thicknesses. If you want it to be uniform, you want to maintain the number of passes per line. That is as simple as it can get. And the other thing is, if you want to highlight a line, one of the ways to do that, extra pass and you get a thicker line. Let's say you want your outer border to be thicker than the rest of that line, and it's something I've done many times. I'll do all this 2-pass work all the way inside of all that stuff that's inside the design, and then get out to the outer edge, and after I finish my second pass, go back for a third pass. Now, I am going to tell you that I draw each of those individually. I'm going to show you guys that real quick. Like I said, I don't think I'm going to go to all the detail I wanted to go to today because there is so much to cover here, and it is so much of what we do in digitizing. But I do really want to quickly cover small curves and offsetting your nodes, offsetting your stitch penetration points real quick before we kind of finish out this stuff. And like I said, we may not be able to do as much with the satin stitches today as I had wanted to. I still think we got to some good essentials that were worthwhile. And it might behoove me to do a satin stitch only episode. I know it sounds crazy to focus down on one stitch type and just beat it into the ground, but honestly, that may be a worthwhile thing to do. In any case, one of the things I also teach about is small curves. If you are drawing and you use curved nodes, right? So let's say you can see what we're doing here. In Brilliance, we have 3 kinds of nodes. We have this square, which is a line node. A line segment is defined by the node that completes it. So whatever the line, when it's going into a node, that node, the node it's going into, defines whether it can be curved or straight or what have you. That's what happens. The second node in a path depends or defines what it can be. And in a curve, you actually have to go through this a continuous curve, which is a curved node up here, a circle. You actually need 3 nodes because that continuous curve node can only be part of that continuous curve when it's in the middle between 2 other nodes. So you have to go through. Curves go through a node. If we go to a corner or we finish a line, they end at that node. So just to think about that. But here's the thing. We were drawing here, and we can see we have a straight line that goes through a continuous curve node into a cusp node. So this is a corner node where it can be curves on either side. It could be a line with a curve. It can be a curve on either side. It can be whatever. It's just a cusp. It indicates that we can change from here. What we'll see is because our stitch length is as it is, let's just imagine that this is a very small curve and this is like a 3 millimeter stitch. Well, if this curve is a very small curve and 3 millimeters goes from here to here, well, if we're trying to kind of estimate that curve, unless we do automatic shortening of some way, or if we get very, very small, even it might stymie the automatic shortening that we have set up, you're going to find that this curve just cannot approximate. So people are saying, "Why I drove this curve and now it looks terrible." Well, the truth of the matter is it will look better frequently for you to go ahead and drop hard nodes and control the kind of polygon you're forming, even with one line of stitching. You may want to evenly space out the lines that go around that curve, and you might get a better look, especially than if you use curved nodes, or let's say you import an SVG file and it's got curves in it. Then all we can do is estimate them with the straight lines of the stitches. And if our stitch length isn't small enough, it really cannot, even with automation, like I said, automatic short stitching, which can happen and depending on software and settings, it can't actually estimate that curve. So if you've got a very small curve, it is often useful to go ahead and say, I'm not going to bother with curved nodes. I'm going to use hard nodes, which is every one of these is a line where I'm going to drop the needle, and I'm going to control where that needle drops to estimate the curve without letting the stitches get too short. So that can be a valuable thing we can do. And I just want to kind of point that out and to say the other thing we can do is this. And this is the one where some people really get kind of, this is their aha moment. I'm going to move my big head out of the way here so we can see this a little bit better for you guys. I call it rounding when we're doing two passes. The thing is, whenever people do straight stitch detail, the real temptation is if you've drawn a line and you've got an endpoint and it's not part of a big complex outline, it's just one segment out of a complex outline, it's very tempting to either grab that same line you drew, copy it and paste it, and just flip the start and end points so that it just traces back along the direction you already came, or to use a double running stitch, which some software, I know Stitch Artist does have a double running. There's nothing wrong with it, but you do understand that when we're on small curves like this, where they start to look a little polygonal, you're going to get the same penetration points both times. So if the software is doing a double run, or you are copying and pasting the exact same line with the exact same settings on top of itself, the two runs will drop the needle at exactly the same spot. And if we look at that, we get this. So you see the double run over here. And I've got the numbers of the stitches because you can just see what's happening essentially here. And hopefully you can see my cursor a little bit as I run over here. You go from 1 to 2 here. It's like 1, 2, 3, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 6, 7, right? And we come back around, 7 to 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and it drops the needle points exactly in that same spot every time. Sometimes, depending on your values and the size of this curve or how long your stitches are, you get a more angular look and it looks a little thin and a little weedy in the corners. Whereas if you run both times, and what I mean by this, you draw the way out, you draw the way back in, you draw both times, so you're not copying and pasting, you're not using a double run and just having the start and end point at the same spot. You are offsetting two different run stitches. And as you draw, either manually if you're on a really small curve, or just in general, either manually offsetting individual stitches, or if you're just in general on a larger border, you just offset where your nodes are placed. Generally, you will be able to get to this point where the stitch penetration points will offset. Now, on very, very, very small curves, little tiny sub couple millimeters, where we're trying to just kind of round out a curve, make it look better, we're doing it manually. What you can see is if you offset the run coming back from the other side, slightly offsetting those points in between or just off from the existing penetration points can make it look more round. And you see on the right-hand side, though it is not a stitched sample, you do see that this offsetting makes it look more round. It's the same number of stitches, and the stitches are still the same length roughly, and they are straight stitches. However, we have that one kind of polygon we already saw here, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But if we see, we've offset stitch 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 in between the other points. And what we get is a curve that looks more rounded and a little bit thicker. But that rounded curve is going to look a lot nicer. Offsetting your points on the second run, drawing one line and then drawing the second line. Yes, I know it means drawing twice for the same shape. I gotcha. But I draw all of my lines twice. Very, very rarely do I just use a double running stitch, or do I copy and paste? Have you seen me do it? Absolutely. We were looking at that dragon earlier, and some of the lines in the wing were exactly just on top of each other. And I'm actually going to show you guys that again. If they are right on top of each other, exactly where they were, even though they're a double run, you'll notice that just looks a little rougher, right? It doesn't look quite as good. It doesn't look quite as even. And actually, we've got that guy right here. So let's go ahead and pop this guy back up. In this wing, you can see, yes, it's double run, but the penetration points, they are exactly the same. And where they are exactly the same, we get a real bean stitch look instead of the kind of offset look we have in other places where they are not exactly on top of each other. And the curvature where the offsets happen looks nicer, looks more complete. We look at this wing where I've got some copy pasted lines or some double run lines, and where those stitch lines are exactly on top of each other on both runs, the penetration points look accentuated, the shadows are a little heavier, and the lines look a little more broken, especially in light colors. Dark colors, you're just going to have a better time. But yeah, you can do this rounding, especially in dark colors. It very much softens the corners on a small curve like that. But otherwise, you can get these kind of stitchy broken lines in light colors. And certainly, if the penetration points are exactly on top of each other, they really can be quite pronounced. All right. So what I think I'm going to do, folks, though it is very tempting to head out into satin stitch territory and continue on with that, I think what I'm going to do, folks, is either I might record something and have it out as a separate show, or I may, if I don't have a guest coming up next week, I may go ahead and jump into the columns and satins. Sitting here at about an hour and 16, we're definitely in bonus time. Yes, I know I often do an hour and a half, but I think to let folks go for the day, I do absolutely think we will talk more about it. Like I said, I've got some stuff I want to talk about. Certainly want to talk about tapering satin stitches. I'll bring the image up again. It is something that's in my mascot class that I taught a couple of weeks ago, the pre-recorded class or the pre-recorded session, not class, episode, session, whatever it is. But it was directly from my mascot class. This concept of tapered strokes is something I wanted to talk about again, the way we can taper and thin out columns without them looking terrible when they have to get very small. If that's something you want to look at, go and look at that if you can't wait. If not, I think we're going to have like a satin stitch specific piece, and maybe we'll talk more about texture and insets and some of the other stuff too. I think I'll do a satin stitch specific episode. I still think the time was well worth spending on straight stitches. And even though we didn't get to double back stitches or multiple count stem stitches or any of that, I think there's something there that we got to. The essence of how individual stitches work, the way shadows and penetrations work, offsetting your individual runs, all of that stuff is super valuable in getting solid lines and getting the line thickness you want. Digitizing in tours is valuable. So we will talk about some more of this stuff later, but I think we'll do a satin stitch specific, and maybe we'll do a little bit, or maybe we'll just do a part 2 of line defining styles and get into our satin stitches, but we will get into more of that stuff and the motif stuff coming up next week. All right, with that, folks, if you don't have a chance to catch me next week, then I hope you have a good time either way. In between times, if you are running stuff and you're not entirely inundated with holiday projects and orders, then run some stuff out, folks. Make some samples, make some interesting new stuff with new textures, run out shapes at different stitch lengths, try them with a double set or a double straight stitch line or 2 copy and pasted lines, and then do an offset. Even if you just take the second one and turn it, let's do a couple circles and turn one by a certain amount, like a couple millimeters, so we can see what happens when the stitch penetration points don't line up. Try some of this stuff out, especially at those small detail levels. We might get it. Like I said, I think I'm going to do a second run of this episode because I didn't get to talk about reducing detail in faces and stuff like that. So by all means, what I can really recommend for you to do is stitch some stuff out and watch it run, look at it, do some measurements, and really just get the thread onto the fabric. If you have a question and you're curious, if you have the software to do it and you have a little bit of time and materials, the best way to answer your question is to try it one way, try it the other way, and compare the two. It will always tell you the truth, whereas the screen is always trying to lie. All right, folks. With that, thank you for being here, and I absolutely can't wait to do it again next week.